I'm Bell. I am a senior technical architect in the connections engineering team and have 2+ decades in the collaboration space now. And during the transition from IBM to HCL, I inherited responsibility for a set of the technologies that we affectionately call Customizer. And that is what I'm going to be talking about here today. As it may be a first time that people have heard about that, and maybe as a refresher for those who have come across it before or might still be using it. That's my topic for the next half hour.
Yeah, I think you can just start.
Okay, thanks.
Get on.
The obligatory disclaimer, although I'm not talking about any future-looking statements here, so I'm really talking about current state. And I split the talk here into 3 main sections. So a little bit of a refresher or an intro into what is Customizer and what is the intent behind this thing we call Customizer. Its name gives away the game just a little bit. There are a couple of different deployment options with Customizer and its associated services. I'm going to talk about some diagrams to illustrate those a little bit. How to sort of get started, plus how to do a sort of more production grade deployment. And then thirdly, how does this bring business value, or what are some of the use cases, typical use cases that are seen with Customizer, and how are customers using it with their connections environment or within their connections environment. So at its core, Customizer is a proxy service. It takes requests from end users and it passes those requests along to connections, and then it makes decisions based on the request and response about whether or not to modify what is coming back from connections to the end user. And in this way, Customizer is able to do exactly as its name suggests. It is able to manipulate the responses to change the behavior or the look and feel or other aspects of the user experience as those requests pass back and forth. It's based on a microservices architecture, so it is a Docker image that runs in a Docker runtime as part of what we used to affectionately call the pink stack. And it is delivered either as part of the component pack overall. So anyone who has looked at component pack services, Customizer is one of those. And it is also in a more standalone version, which we call Customizer Lite. It's the same Docker image, but it is able to be deployed without all of the Kubernetes and other associated component pack technologies. So it's very much more a slimmed down, easy to get started kind of deployment for those who want to play with it, try it out without having to go to the extent of installing all of the other component pack pieces first. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. So as I said, proxies requests to the back end, and based on a set of criteria or rules that are defined by an administrator or a developer, it chooses which requests to modify or how to modify those requests and responses, sorry, and it passes back the response to the end user with some level of manipulation, either some JavaScript that's been injected into the page, which can be used to pretty much manipulate anything about the behavior of the response. Typically, that's targeted at changes to the document object model. So different functionality within one of the connections apps or pages, or it can inject style sheet information to change look and feel and layout of pages. So those are the sort of the 2 predominant methods by which it operates. And we'll talk a little bit more about those when we get to the typical use cases. It is able to be used to proxy third-party requests or requests to third-party sites. So as a way to bring in other information from other sites into a response, but allowing that only for sort of whitelisted domains or specific users, or to not allow that for specific users. That's where the access control part comes in. It is able to inject external content in an iframe container. One of the examples I will show later is a mechanism to do that. Again, from a sort of an integration point of view, so you can bring in other content from outside of Connections relatively simply to put it on a page. So its overall goal is really to be able to allow an administrator or a developer, typically in tandem, to customize the overall user experience in Connections without having to go touch the actual code that we deliver. So it's one of its benefits is that it is really durable across upgrades. So the definitions of the changes and the custom JavaScript and CSS live outside of the code, the Connections code itself, and so they remain in place across upgrades, and they typically function the same before and after an upgrade. So in the past, if you've had to manipulate the actual files that get put on the file system in a Connections deployment, there are ways to back things up and put them back again afterwards. But Customizer gives a pretty simple method for having upgrades to the user experience that do persist and make life easier in the upgrade sense. And regardless of the deployment, it's the same code. It's the same, it's a Docker image-based microservice. So whether you, regardless of which flavor of Connections is being deployed, whether it's standalone on-premises Connections or the Connections MT variant for our MSP partners, whether or not you're deploying the full component pack or just the Customizer Lite simplified deployment, it's the exact same Docker image across all of those, and it behaves the same way regardless. So the idea behind Customize is to really try and help customizers with this spectrum of need, or this tension, as I sometimes call it, where obviously maintenance and rollout and deployment are much simpler if you can take something off the shelf and implement it as is, without making lots of changes, without wanting to do lots of customizations. However, Connections is never, I would say, deployed in its entirety in a vacuum. It is always connected to some other or used alongside some other systems in a customer environment or a partner environment. And there are always a desire to change things, to adjust, to sort of make the product fit better in a particular environment, if you will. Your customers and partners always have specific needs. And so there's a natural tension there between not wanting to change too much, but wanting to make it fit better in a particular environment. And Customizer is a great way to help with that. So it helps to bridge that gap, if you will, and to allow some level of customization without, as I said, having to change the implementation of the Connections product itself. And it's relatively simple to use, especially if you're good with JavaScript. I get my hands dirty a little bit with JavaScript, not too much, but it's very powerful in terms of the kinds of things that you can do with Customizer. And really, you're limited only by your own imagination. Once you have the Customizer service running, there's no end to the kinds of things that you could think of to add into your experience, shall we say. So let's talk a little bit about deployment options. I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds here because we have only 30 minutes, but I did want to sort of contrast the two different flavors of deployment that we typically see. And so, the transition or the use of microservices architecture is brings with it other disciplines and technologies and skills required. And so the Customizer Lite variation of the deployment really only needs Docker and Docker Compose to take the place of the orchestration layer that would normally be Kubernetes in a more full-blown component pack deployment. So some ability with Docker is required because, as I said, the Customizer services are deployed as Docker images. So you need a Docker runtime and a place to store those images. But this is a relatively simple sort of two if you think of this as two parts, there's the connections environment on the right, and sort of simplified down into connections host may or may not be a single host, but it's the connections environment that already exists. And the other part is a Docker host or a Docker runtime, in which these three services. So Customizer is made up of three specific services. So Customizer is sort of the general marketing term or product sort of terminology that's used to describe the capability. But if you actually look at the services that run in Docker, they are MW proxy, which stands for middleware proxy, which is the engine itself that takes the requests and modifies the responses. And it is supported by two other services, the app registry service and the app registry client. And those are the places where the definitions are stored. The app registry service stores the definitions about what requests it should be modifying and what JavaScript files or CSS files it should use for various types of requests. So that is the configuration aspect of Customizer. The app registry client then provides the UI with which an administrator can create or update or delete those definitions. So those three go hand in hand to make up what we colloquially call Customizer. And as I said, they run in Docker, and requests to connections typically are fired through some kind of front-end load balancer or proxy to make decisions about whether the request should go through Customizer and be modified, or whether or not it's a request for something in connections that is not intended to be modified and does not need to go through Customizer. And so there is this decision point in the request flow that is made so that not every request has to go through Customizer, whether or not it is to be modified or not, right? That's a simple sort of workload statement. There is nothing to stop you sending every request through Customizer. It will just ignore those things for which it is not configured to insert changes. But in larger environments, obviously, there is there is no need to send requests through there that are not going to be handled by it. Docker Compose is a simple command line tool that is used to start up and shut down the Docker images and provide some level of configuration information for each of the runtime containers. And the persistent storage in this model is the file system rather than Mongo. And the caching aspect of this is memory rather than Redis. So as we look at when we look at the next deployment option, you'll see more boxes on the page. There are more sort of support services that support these three containers. And so this is as I said, a very much simplified deployment model. So we don't have to know Kubernetes, we don't have to know Mongo, we don't have to know Redis. It's just Docker and some Docker images. So it's very simple, as I said, to get started with, to try it, to maybe test out whether or not your ideas for the types of customizations you want to do are well suited to this particular implementation method. So when we move on to a component pack deployment, actually, I neglected to say the Nginx or the upfront proxy load balancer in that previous diagram can be on the same host as the Docker images. It doesn't have to be separate. Typically, in a component pack deployment, there is some kind of proxy host in front of, whether it's HA proxy or Nginx, in front of an environment, because typically it's a little bit larger environment. That is typically on a dedicated host in this sense. But instead of Docker Compose being the orchestrator, we're now looking at Kubernetes to orchestrate and manage the runtime of the microservices. You'll see here the three MW proxy, app registry client, app registry service microservices that were on the previous slide. They are the same, but to this are now added Redis and Mongo as the persistent layers of storage to support those services. So this is, a next step in the evolution of the deployment for those who are, more comfortable with Kubernetes and also managing a Kubernetes environment. You don't really need to know too much about Mongo and Redis. They are support services that are deployed as part of component pack and and are used by the services, but rarely, if ever, have I ever had to do anything hands-on with those two services. They just run in their containers and support the needs of the microservices that use them. Obviously, this is not we're not getting into the level of detail here of multiple clusters for high availability, but obviously those who are familiar with Kubernetes know all about the additional mechanisms that are available to run multiple instances of all of the services and multiple Kubernetes clusters, multiple worker nodes for distributing workload and for creating a higher availability deployment model. So how do we see this being used, or what are some examples that bring business value here to our customers and partners? I broke this into three sort of categories just for sort of thinking about the types of customizations that we typically see. The very simplest ones tend to be cosmetic. There's an example here that's just using for those of you who might be familiar with Visual Update, we used Customizer to deliver that a while ago now, which was just a refresh of the styling of the UI. So you'll see a couple of snips here that contrast, button shapes, button hover colors, the highlights on the tabs and things. So for branding purposes, for customers who want to use Connections but don't necessarily want their users to have to deal with the fact that it is a particular product like Connections, or they want it to be used and look like their intranet is a typical use case, or other predominant systems in their environment for adoption purposes to make it more approachable for their end users, then this is a great way to do that. It's relatively straightforward to inject some modified styling information to manipulate just purely the way things look on the glass. It's also a pretty good way to do A/B testing if you're thinking about doing some changes to your overall theme, your look and feel of your systems. You could very simply, because Customizer allows you to target changes based on your end users or URL pattern or other attributes like header patterns, you can very easily have these customizations apply to some sets of users but not others. So I might have used A/B testing in its own category here, actually, but the idea of you want to try out some new styles, some new look and feel for your environment, you could certainly use Customizer to simply and easily turn that on for a few users and let them see what it looks like and get feedback. So that's a very, very common use case that's fairly trivial to implement, but high value. The second category here is functional changes. So the idea that you want to change more than just the look and feel, but add or remove or change the behavior of the Connections apps or associated items. The example here in the little screen snips are the navbar. The idea of adding to the navbar, or in some cases, customers want to remove things from the navbar. The example here is a web meeting icon to launch the end user's web meeting of choice directly from the Connections navbar. And a number of these things that we have I'll talk about some links later, but we have these examples are in a GitHub repository, so you can download them and try them out and play with them yourself. The files menu is another good place where customers tend to want to extend actions on files, to change change actions that can be done on files. They might want to hide certain configuration choices. For example, if you typically allow public communities, but you have some users you don't want to be able to create public communities, you could have a Customizer definition that hides the checkbox for a certain set of users, so they're not allowed to, or doesn't allow them to choose things that would result in a public community, for example. Or file sharing. So that's the idea of sort of taking away things or hiding things that are not relevant to some or all users. And again, that could be used in an A/B testing scenario, certainly to manipulate the functionality and get feedback from users about how they feel about that, or to see how it impacts them. And then lastly is sort of probably the broader topic of integration in general, the idea of bringing connections into or integrating with other systems, both internal or external. The example shown here is to add a simple share to Teams button on the page, which helps you to integrate with Teams as an example of something we delivered in the Connections 7 timeframe. So Customizer is used here to inject this on pages, but it's actually using JavaScript from Microsoft. The other mechanism, which I'll show a little bit later, is the idea of using a simple iframe to pull in content into Connections page from another application. Obviously, if you're using iframes, you have to worry a little bit more about cross-site security and that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily suited to every application or use case that you might want, but it is a fairly simple way, especially on internal systems where things might be protected behind a similar domain or access through a similar domain. Then that makes life a little bit easier. But the idea of connections participating with other systems to make the end user's life easier or more functionally rich. So those are the three typical types of buckets that we see in terms of how Customizer is used. And obviously, within each of those buckets, as I said, your imagination really is the only limiting factor about the kinds of things you could do with Customizer. So hopefully I have a little bit of time here for a couple of demos. So I want to talk a little bit about what a Customizer extension app looks like, sort of the definition, the idea of custom JavaScript and CSS files, and then we'll enable a couple of examples to show how it modifies the experience. Let me go over to, where's my browser? There it is. So this is the preview site that we have right now. Vanilla Connection 7. Nothing in particular there. I am logged in as an administrator, and the App Registry UI service that I talked about delivers this user interface to allow for creation of and manipulation of the various integration definitions that we want to see. So the first one I'm going to turn on is Visual Update. This is classic CSS injection. If we look at the code editor here, the definitions are JSON format for those who've not seen them before. You can define one or more extensions. So there's an extensions array here. And as we look at this one, it should be relatively easy to see that there are entries for different applications. So blogs, metrics, homepage, a variety of things, forums, bookmarks, those kinds of things. And what this says is that for URL paths that contain the reference dog ear, this is enabled. And what we want to do is inject this particular style sheet. Okay. And if we look at the extensions list, we'll see that there are, so this is a UI version of that JSON. You'll see that you can turn individual extensions on and off as well. Even though they're all defined, you might choose. So this is again why this is kind of handy for A/B testing, because you've got very simple flexibility in terms of enabling or disabling the customization as well. And if we go back and do a simple page refresh, hit the right key, what we should see is that the home page is now fairly subtly, but you can see that the nav bar highlights are different, the colors here are different, the tab underlying colors here are different. So just with that simple enable of that extension, we've applied an entirely different set of styles on this particular on the different pages, and because I turned them all on, they're actually on all of the different pages. This is from the example screenshot I took where the buttons are filled in now as opposed to and are rounded, not square. So, and I can just as simply go back to here and turn that off again and refresh the page. And we are back to standard Connection 7 styles. So that's very much the sort of look and feel category but you see how simple that is. The second one I want to do is I'll share the Teams example. Let's take a quick look at this extension. So right now it's disabled. It's not functional. It has a payload here which says include this small snippet of JavaScript, which ultimately loads the Teams Share UI with JavaScript from Microsoft. It has some cache control, and this is global. This should be present on every page response from every HTML response from Connection should include this customization. So let's go back here and turn it on. And now if I reload the page, what I should see is the Share to Teams button. And if I click on that, now you know what, I'm not logged into Teams right now. What you would see, oh, maybe I am, it's persisted in the background. So what you'd see here is the UI from Microsoft that allows you to pick a channel or a person. Actually, yeah, a chat. This is a channel. Pick a channel into which you want to share a link to this page. If you happen to be having conversation in Teams, Adam was just talking about Teams chats and things. But this is a way to, again, to facilitate Connections content or sharing of Connections content or bringing awareness of Connections content into other things. So that's a simple example of adding functionality into a page that might be useful to end users. Obviously, that destination could be any other system in which sharing a link or bringing Connections content to some other system is useful. And again, it's as simple as turning that off again to change that behavior. And the last one I'm going to do is an example of the iframe, and I honestly picked a relatively trivial example here. I'm actually just going to add in the landing page from same time meetings in an iframe. Now, the landing page from same times meeting is not designed necessarily to be shared in an iframe, but for the purposes of examples here, that's what I'm going to use. So I'm just going to turn that on. And Customizer is doing all of the work to manipulate the DOM here to create those who are a little bit more technically inclined to create a div tag with which to associate the iframe and to load it on the page. So when I refresh this page here, what we should see is an iframe with my same time meetings in it. And so I can pick and choose to launch my various meetings from there. Obviously, as I said, it's not necessarily designed to be in an iframe, this particular thing, but as far as communicating the idea of bringing content into a Connections page, very simply, I mean, literally all I had to do there was create this particular type of extension and tell it which URL I wanted and how big a box to make it. You can apply styles to the iframe, so you can in fact style the iframe more specifically for the content that's coming in, to blur the lines a little bit around the mixture of content on the page. I didn't go that far. I didn't think it was necessary for the purposes of this demo. Let me just switch back to slides here. I put some links, relevant links here. Probably the most important one of the examples, the last one here, there's a GitHub repository that has a number of examples of some of the things I've shown and a variety of others to help sort of get the creative juices flowing. But really, it's anything you can think of that you can do in JavaScript and CSS, you can use with Customizer to improve the lives of your users, shall we say.